Death at Bishop's Keep. Chapter 51. I prithee now with most petitionary vehemence tell me who it is. Oh, wonderful, wonderful, and most wonderful, wonderful, and yet again wonderful, and after that out of all whooping. William Shakespeare, As You Like It, Part 3, Act 2. Kate got out of the pony cart at the corner and, after lingering an appropriate time, walked down the street to number 7, carrying Aunt Jagger's tapestry knitting bag. She marched with spine erect, chin up, and shoulders straight. Outwardly she was a woman of calm and deliberate demeanor, a woman who knew her purpose. But within, all was chaos. Within, Kate found herself nearly overwhelmed by the sheer folly of her mad scheme. The ride from Bishop's Keep had given her time to consider what she was about to, and to think better of it. She had played a few juvenile tricks in her day, lurking, for instance, outside the steward's cabin on the ship, on the lookout for Mrs. Snodgrass's diamonds. But she had never done anything as absurd as this. She had never accused anyone of murder. And to make matters worse, not even a few glances at the photograph she was carrying with her could restore her confidence, for she found herself uncertain about the identity of the gypsy boy. Guilty or not guilty, she was no longer sure. But it was too late to change her mind. The die was cast. Arrangements had been made, and if she did not do her part, well, she had to, that was all. She owed it to Aunt Sabrina, if not to Aunt Jaggers. 2 lives wasted, and for what? At the thought, her purpose firmed. She went up the stairs and rang the bell. There was silence within. Kate rang again, mentally scrabbling for something to say. Should she be delicate or direct? Should she open the conversation with a forthright challenge, or allow the discussion to take its own course, following its natural meander into the topic she wished to pursue? But before Kate could devise a plan of action, the bell was answered, not by a servant, but by the very person she had come to see. Kate made herself smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Farnsworth." "Why, good morning, Miss Hartley," Mrs. Farnsworth replied. "Please, come in. I'm afraid you have caught me answering my own bell, since it is my maid's half-day." Her golden brown hair was bound back loosely, and a green gown flowed without a waist from the shoulders, giving her a look of pastoral innocence, yet with a complexly mysterious knowledge behind the eyes, like one of Rossetti's maidens. "Thank you," Kate said, masking her relief in formal politeness. She had recalled the vicar's saying that Mrs. Farnsworth had only one servant, and had hoped that the woman might be out. Mrs. Farnsworth's eyes became shadowed. "I was appallingly grieved and shocked to hear of your aunt's death. Your note did not elaborate. Please, come to the parlor and tell me what happened. It was a tragic accident, I assume." Without answering, Kate followed her. The room was dim and chilly, palely lighted by the gas lamp on the wall beside the fireplace, and warmed by a fire so small as to almost be symbolic. Kate noticed that the coal hob on the hearth was nearly empty, and wondered if Mrs. Farnsworth had simply allowed herself to run out, or was effecting a necessary economy. Mrs. Farnsworth put her hands into the embroidered pockets of her dress. "If you like, I can prepare tea. One learns, you know, not to depend upon one's servants for all necessities of life." "Thank you, no tea," Kate said. She sat on the plum velvet settee facing the fire, on the edge as decorum demanded, while Mrs. Farnsworth took the chair where she had obviously been sitting, wrapped in paisley shawl. Between them was a small rosewood table that held a glass dish of shells, several small framed photographs of Mrs. Farnsworth in various costume poses. Mrs. Farnsworth pulled the shawl around her shoulders. "Now, please, Mrs. Hartley," she said, "if it's not too trying, perhaps you will tell me how your aunt died." "It is very trying," Kate said, "but I will tell you." Lacking a strategy by which to plot a more devious course to the subject, she simply spoke what came first to mind, which was the truth. "She was poisoned." Mrs. Farnsworth's hands flew to her mouth. She gasped. "Poisoned?" Kate kept her back straight, her eyes fixed intently on Mrs. Farnsworth. Since they had already arrived at their subject, she would take the offensive. She could do no worse than fail. And even if she were mistaken about Mrs. Farnsworth's role in her aunt's death, now that she was actually here, the possibility of error seemed dreadfully real. She doubted that the woman would make an issue of the matter. There was, after all, the business of the forged letters. Kate screwed her courage to the sticking point and plunged ahead. Mrs. Farnsworth, this is not a stage, and you and I are not merely players. You know very well that my aunt was poisoned, for you provided the means of her death. You killed her. Mrs. Farnsworth's brown eyes grew large, and she gave a little gasping laugh. I? My dear Miss Utley, what fearful lunacy is this? Have you lost your mind? Have I? Kate wondered to herself, but she had nowhere to go but forward, doggedly following the track of what seemed to be the truth. I am accusing you, she said, of the murders of the Sabrina Ardley and Bernice Jaggers. The open mouth and widened eyes registered the incredulity, the simultaneous headshake of a sorrowful pity. I very much fear that you have lost your mind, Miss Ardley. Perhaps it is the grief of untimely death for which I hope you will accept my deepest condolences. Sabrina was my friend, but frankly, my dear, I have not an idea who in the world this Jaggers person is whom you say I have. The slightest smile, as if of disbelief, lifted her lips. Poisoned. Bernice Jaggers was the sister of Sabrina Ardley, Kate said, her eyes on the other's face. That little smile had hardened her resolve. The evening before last, both ate the mushroom pudding that was prepared from mushrooms you brought to Bishop's Keep. Among them was a death cap. My aunt died yesterday. She felt a deep, icy chill, as if winter itself were in her bones. Both were ill for hours. They suffered agonizing death. Mrs. Farnsworth cast her eyes down. I am most sorry for your sad bereavement, Miss Utley. There was a catch in her impassioned voice, and when she looked up, the trace of a tear in her eye. She leaned forward, speaking with urgency. But I assure you that I have never called at Bishop's Keep, and never having been there, I certainly could not have brought such a thing as mushrooms. She made a little grimace as if the word summoned up images of dirt and leaves. Or a death cat, did you say? I regret I do not know what that is. Kate's heart was in her throat, and she was oblivious to the chill room around her, the pale gloom, the dying fire. Had she made a terrible mistake? Had she accused a woman who was guilty of foolishness but innocent of murder? But she had no other course. She could only pursue. She steeled herself. You came, she said, relentless, twice. The first time you attempted to break into the library to steal the forged letters and the cipher document. As you escaped, you left a hat. The second time, you came in the disguise of a gypsy selling mushrooms. Mrs. Farnsworth sat quite still. Only her eyes moved with a quick, darting motion right to left, and there was a slight mottling high on her cheek. For the first time, Kate began to think that she might be right. With the thought came both relief and heightened apprehension. If Mrs. Farnsworth was the killer, how could she wring a confession from her? The woman was as cold and icy hard as a glacier. When Mrs. Farnsworth spoke, her voice was distant. I see that you insist on persevering in these scandalous and absurd accusations despite my assurance that I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. She rose, her bearing imperious, contempt and revulsion on her face. I must therefore decline to speak with you any further. Please leave. She was the perfect picture of offended, outraged sensibility. How could the actress be dislodged from the role? Kate reached into the knitting bag beside her on the settee and took out an envelope. I fear that will not be as easy as that, Mrs. Farnsworth. There's proof of your visit. The other woman's eyes darkened imperceptibly, but her face remained impassive. When she spoke, her voice was without inflection. Proof? What proof could you possibly have? This photograph, Kate said. She opened the envelope and held it up. It quite clearly shows you in your gypsy costume at the kitchen floor, a basket of mushroom in your hand. Mrs. Farnsworth stood unmoving. Kate put the photograph on the table. Perhaps you would care to examine it. Quickly, as if she could not help herself, the woman's glance went to the photograph. And then, with the subtlest of facial expressions, perhaps just a smoothing of the skin around the eyes, her self-confidence seemed to return. She lifted her chin. A cursory examination, I suppose, she said with cool amusement, might suggest that the figure in this photograph could be a woman. It might even be concluded, although the conclusion would certainly require an extraordinary feat of imagination, to bear the slight resemblance to me, and to Rosalind. Is the gypsy costume not your costume from As You Like It, in which Rosalind transformed into Ganymede dresses as a boy?" Mrs. Farnsworth's tone was coloured by a half-contemptuous disdain. "But the taking of life is not the sport for ladies. Why in the world should I wish to kill your aunt, Miss Ardley? The idea is outrageous." "It was not my aunt you intended to kill," Kate said, feeling anger, "but my aunt, Sabrina Ardley, a good and kind lady and a friend to you. And you probably intended to kill me as well. The idea is not at all outrageous when you consider what is at stake. The reputation of Dr. Westcott, your own reputation and livelihood, the continuation of the Order of the Golden Dawn, all of enormous importance to you, I warrant, and worth a few risks." Mrs. Farnsworth looked down at Kate. Her eyes betrayed the first slightest hint of fear, but her voice was still firm. "Miss Ardley, would you be so good as to make your point plain, if you have a point, that is? As proof, I fear that your photograph falls far short." "The letters," Kate said. She drew a paper-wrapped bundle from the knitting bag. "The letters purportedly written by Fraulein Sprengel authorizing Dr. Westcott to establish the Order of the Golden Dawn. They are not authentic. They are forgeries, as is the ciphered document." Aunt Sabrina guessed as much, and Mr. Mather's letter to you, which she read, confirmed her suspicion and perhaps her idea that the dead Frenchman found in the Colchester excavation was connected to you. She confronted you with what she knew and told you that she intended to reveal the secret to the Order at large. You had to ensure her silence. Miss Farnsworth started to speak, then stopped. Her eyes met Kate. Her look was compounded of acrimony, a kind of pitying scorn, and some sort of deeply interior conflict. For a long moment she seemed to grapple with herself, then she turned and went slowly to the desk in the corner. A moment later she turned back again and gestured at the bundle Kate had placed on the table beside the photograph. "Those are the letters?" "They are the documents you attempted to steal several nights ago from the library at Bishop's Keep," Kate said. Her voice was disbelieving. "Do you believe me to have been an intruder?" "Yes, you left your hat behind. Rosalind's hat, of course." Kate added, You had to have the letters, for the forgery is not clever. The fraud would be abundantly clear to any objective reader who could reveal the hoax and show Dr. Westcott to be a sham and a charlatan. And if that happened, the entire order would collapse, as you well knew." "I see," Mrs. Farnsworth said reflectively, "that you have given this matter considerable thought. I wonder, while you were thinking, did you think perhaps of some accommodation we might make? Accommodation?" Mrs. Farnsworth smiled and not touch her glacial eyes. "My dear Miss Ardley, you may think me wicked, but I do not think you naive. You come alone to accuse me of—" She pulled her brows tightly together. "You have come alone, have you not?" Kate inclined her head. Miss Farnsworth laughed. "There you see. You come alone to accuse me of murder, bringing your proof. What else am I to conclude but that your evidence, the photograph, the documents, is for sale?" Kate thought quickly. This was perhaps the opening she needed. When she spoke, her voice held an admiring candor. "You are indeed perceptive, Miss Farnsworth. You have found me out. In return, then, I will be frank with you." "Ah, yes," Miss Farnsworth said with dry irony. "Let us both be frank." Kate allowed herself a small smile. "I am not inclined to seek vengeance for my aunt's murders, for I too have profited. I am to inherit Ardley's estate. By the same token, I do not seek to sell the evidence of your guilt for money." She paused. Mrs. Farnsworth was watching her observantly, still standing, her eyes intent, her hands in the pockets of her gown. "What I do seek is the participation of the Order. I find that I enjoy the association and wish to continue and expand it, and would like to hold the office my aunt held, that of Cancellarius." She raised her voice slightly. "I'm willing to give you the photograph and the documents in return for that appointment and for your verbal confirmation to me that everything I have said here is true." Miss Farnsworth made a condescending gesture. "Confirmation! That part, my dear Catherine— it is Catherine, is it not? Is easy. Of course you are quite right. I did darken my face with umber and disguise myself as a gypsy boy, after the manner of Rosalind. I did carry a basket of mushrooms, including 2 fatal ones, to Bishop's Keep. I knew, you see, that your Aunt Sabrina was exceedingly fond of mushrooms. She said as much the afternoon of the gathering. I did not know that your aunt had a sister, but I was prepared to silence you along with Sabrina, since I could not be sure that she had not spoken of the matter to you. But she was your friend, Kate burst out, half rising. How could you kill her? Mrs. Farnsworth's eyes glinted. Most friendships are feigning, she said. Most loving, mere folly. Kate sank back. I'm sorry, she said. Please go on. My motive was, as you have deduced, your aunt was intent on telling the world that Dr. Westcott forged the cipher documents and the letters that authorized him to establish the order. Some might say he was foolish in doing so, although I say in his defense that he did not intend to deceive. He only meant to enjoy for a little, quite to himself, quite in private, the pleasure of creating a fictional world in which he was given the blessing of the most ancient authorities for his magical work. He had no intention of sharing the letters with others. Thinking of Beryl Bartwell, Kate murmured, but the relationship between life and art is very complex. A fiction can become quite real. And thereby hangs a tale. A smile ghosted across Miss Farnsworth's mouth. You are quite perceptive, Miss Audley. This transformation of art into life might not have happened, however, had it not been for MacGregor Mathers, to whom Dr. Westcott confided his innocent little diversion. It was Mathers who convinced him that the order should be introduced to the public at large. It was Mathers who insisted on using the letters to lend authenticity to the effort. And in time Dr. Westcott began to believe in the truth of his magical fiction. Yes, Miss Farnsworth said. Her voice was coloured by the regretful contempt, as if she were deriding an actor who had been taken in by his part. And Matthews now intended to reveal the fraud in order to discredit the doctor? Miss Farnsworth's mouth hardened. Mathers is a man full of his own glory, greedy for power. From the very beginning he aimed to destroy Dr. Westcott and substitute his own project. I could not permit such a thing to happen. Quite apart from my friendly feelings for the doctor, I have my own interest to protect. As you have quite rightly guessed, the order is a substantial part of my livelihood and will remain so even when I have successfully returned to the stage. At the present time I am quite vulnerable, and do not intend to let Mathers destroy me. But to keep that from happening, Kate said thoughtfully, you will have to destroy Mathers in the same way you destroyed my aunt. Mrs. Farnsworth raised both brows. I commend your insight, Miss Audley. I am glad to say that little business is well under way. A poison has already been set into a certain candy in which Mr. Mathers is known to indulge immoderately. Fairless chocolates. Kate almost gave way to an hysterical giggle. It was a small and ironically fateful world indeed. But Mrs. Farnsworth would not be telling her these things unless she were meant to be the next victim. She tried to think ahead what the woman's next move might be. Mrs. Farnsworth's eyes were frankly defiant. There, my dear, you have it. I stand guilty of everything of which you have accused me. But call me not a fool, for heaven hath sent me fortune. And with respect to your wish to hold the office your aunt has so recently vacated, she pulled down her mouth with a sombre look, the position must be earned through long study of the magical arts. Regrettably, you will not have sufficient time to prepare yourself. She pulled her hand out of her pocket. Fitted neatly into her palm was a small nickel-plated derringer. Kate raised her eyes to Mrs. Farnsworth's face. Her brown eyes were intent, her mouth determined, her chin firm. A remarkable woman with the will to use whatever weapon best ensured the success of her scheme. A person whom Beryl Bartwell could not help but admire, but the admiration quickly chilled by the reality of the situation. This was no time to be doing research. Miss Farnsworth gestured with the gun toward the door. Come now, we'll go down to the cellar. Our business will be much more conveniently concluded there. Kate glanced at the door, feeling apprehensive. This interview had not gone exactly as she had anticipated. What would happen when they went into the hall? Would it be best to... That is quite a small gun, Kate said conversationally, but loudly. Is it real? Mrs. Farnsworth's voice was grim. It may look like a stage property, but I assure you that it's quite powerful for its size. It does, however, make a rather lot of noise, which is one of the reasons for our trip to the cellar. Since you seem to be an imaginative person, I leave you to imagine the others. She stepped behind Kate and planted the gun in the small of her back. Shall we, Miss Audley? Out the door and to your right. Kate bit her lip, Her hands were clammy. Having no choice, she walked ahead of Mrs. Farnsworth. When they reached the hallway door, she stopped once more, her hand on the knob. "Can we not discuss this?" she asked urgently. "Perhaps we could accommodate." "No," Miss Farnsworth said again. Her voice was thin and flat with a brittle edge. "No more discussion. Open the door." Kate opened the door and stepped into the hallway. What happened next occurred with such rapidity that afterwards she was not sure how she would reconstruct the sequence with accuracy. There was a sudden scuffle behind her, a strangled cry, and the gun discharged, the bullet shattering a mirror on the opposite wall. As Kate turned, she saw Mrs. Farnsworth, helpless, was gripped in the powerful embrace of a resolute Mud. Before Kate could speak, an impatient banging sounded on the door. "What's that shooting?" demanded a loud voice. "In the name of the crowd, open this door." Kate stepped to the door and opened it. On the stoop, hand raised, mouth open to shout once more, stood a uniformed policeman. Behind him stood yet another policeman, and behind him again stood Sir Charles Sheridan. When he saw her, Charles' mouth dropped open. Kate bowed her head slightly. "Gentlemen," she said, stepping aside so that they could enter, "how good of you to arrive so speedily."